The goal of our project was to experiment with new locomotion techniques revolving around rotating the player's up direction. While we didn't run any user tests, we wanted to explore the extent to which these techniques disorient users or cause cybersickness and mitigate them when we can. The three locomotion techniques are teleporting to surface normals, rotating the environment with a world in miniature, or WIM, and climbing. The medium we chose as a testbed for these techniques is a chamber-based, light puzzle platformer inspired by games like Portal. To teleport, the player uses a button input to raycast from the right controller. On release, they teleport to the raycast collision point and are immediately rotated so their up direction matches the destination surface as normal. This is a very common locomotion technique, but we've extended it here to let players teleport onto surfaces that are not the initial ground plane. Attached to the player's left hand is a WIM model of their environment. By holding the trigger, the player can rotate this model, and, on release, the virtual environment is rotated to match. To improve our controls, we could add a simple toggle to swap hand functions, so the player can use their dominant hand for pointing and their non-dominant hand for the WIM rotation. The player can squeeze to grab the environment and pull themselves around. Then, releasing the squeeze button drops the player, or they can grab with their other hand to continue climbing. This is intended to help players recover from mistakes when rotating the environment. They can grab onto something if they're falling near it but won't land on it. To minimize disorientation and cybersickness, we implemented an unrealistically slow gravitational acceleration, so the player floats downward instead of falling when they rotate the environment or drop off a climbable surface. This was motivated by research by Morant and Thatachri that found that users in virtual driving simulators experienced more cybersickness in faster highway driving conditions than in slow city driving conditions. When the virtual environment rotates, it is an instant snap rather than a gradual shift. Farmani and Teether found that snapping to increments when artificially rotating the player's view leads to less cybersickness than smoothly rotating that view. We followed this advice even though it might adversely affect the player's mental orientation because we wanted to minimize cybersickness as much as possible. Possible extensions based on our research to further improve comfort include amplified head rotation to reduce neck strain for seated users, and dynamic FOV vignetting proportional to the player's speed. The game features 4 stages. The first 3 are an introduction, as each one is easiest to complete using a different locomotion technique. The final stage is a bit harder and could be completed using any combination of techniques. This classic game design philosophy provides flexibility for experienced VR users and a guiding hand for new ones. Stage 1 is a square room with a ledge, and the player must reach the top of the ledge to complete the stage. This one is intended to be extremely simple and easiest to complete by teleporting. Stage 2 features a pit and a divider with a hazard that resets the player at the bottom. The intended solution is for the player to climb on or around the divider to reach the goal. Stage 3 is a room with a suspended box. The goal is inside the box, and the easiest way to reach it is by rotating the WIM model and falling into the goal. Stage 4 is the most complex. With platforms, the player must bounce between while avoiding hazards. Any technique can be used. Veterans might rotate the room and use climbing to throw themselves between platforms, and new users might just teleport between them.
There are many challenges and roadblocks we faced when implementing the project. All of these roadblocks can be separated into two different eras, or iterations, which are transforming the environment versus transforming the user. Originally, we planned to transform the environment around the player, keeping the user fixed at the origin of the world and having the environment translate and rotate in reaction to the user's locomotion. Since the physics engine we planned to implement couldn't work on the parented meshes, we instead opted to transform the player. In other words, keep the environment stationary, once we started to the implementation stage. However, the locomotion ended up being too difficult to implement, so we opted to scrap all features related to the physics engine, like cube selection and manipulation, and refactored the code to transform the environment instead. The first major challenge was checking collisions between the environment and the player. In the transforming player iteration, we initially planned to let the Canon physics engine handle the collision calculations. However, we couldn't successfully remove the angular velocity from the mesh we used to approximate the dimensions of the player, allowing the mesh, and thus the player, to bounce around and roll after a collision. We then opted to try Babylon's built-in camera collision we did back in assignment 2, but the WebXR camera didn't recognize the camera ellipsoid we put on it and failed to collide with anything. For the transforming environment iteration, I initially thought that I'd be forced to implement collisions manually for each and every stage, as all collision-based features built into Babylon wouldn't work. In typical cliché fashion, I end up coming up with a general solution during a rare walk through the neighborhood. If Babylon's camera ellipsoid detection didn't work, I would make my own. So right when I got back home, I made an ellipsoid mesh that represents the player dimensions as shown in the image to the right. I then checked if it intersected a mesh in the environment. If it does, I move the environment away in small steps until the ellipsoid is no longer intersecting any meshes. Overall, it works decently well and was serviceable as the game's general collision detection system. The next big roadblock was implementing non-isomorphic rotation, where the virtual environment rotates faster than the player's head. In the transforming player iteration, I originally approached it by adding extra rotation to the XR camera as it rotated, but the XR camera's rotation quaternion wouldn't update. With this in mind, I instead conducted the non-isomorphic rotation on a node that stored the current transformation of the player, and then set the camera equal to that node's rotation. Sadly, the camera's rotation lost accuracy over a very short period of time, making it so that looking down would make the camera look forwards, for instance. I tried to implement this feature once again in the translating environment iteration, but it was also fruitless. Instead of adding the extra rotation to the camera, I instead applied the inverse of the extra rotation to the environment. When testing it, I noticed that the stage would rotate in the true XR camera's coordinate space, not the one adjusted through the non-isomorphic rotation. To fix this, I tried parenting the environment to another transform node that stored the rotational difference between the true and adjusted XR camera, but was still somewhat inaccurate over time. Thus, this feature couldn't make it in the final implementation of the game. Dynamic vignetting was another roadblock we faced during the implementation stage. When implementing it, I used a square root ramp to increase the vignette's weight, as changes to the user's FOV become more apparent as the FOV decreases. The x-axis of the ramp is the player velocity, and the y is the vignette weight maxed out at 50. The feature worked when testing with the WebXR debugger, but didn't quite work with the Quest, as the left eye camera was completely black when the vignetting was enabled. The main lesson we learned from this project is to attempt, as best as humanly possible, to avoid tampering with WebXR's transforms where possible, especially the XR camera. Accessing the transforms is a little buggy, but manageable overall, but trying to modify these transforms is the literal devil. Another thing we noticed is that WebXR is more bare bones and buggy than we initially thought. For instance, the Babylon's built-in camera ellipsoid collision isn't implemented, which made it painful to check for player collisions with the environment. Both controller rotations also start at y is equal to 180 degrees for some reason, though they show up as 0 degrees in the debugger. Also, the Z rotation of the controller does a complete 180 randomly, which made syncing up with the world in miniature to the controller an absolute pain.
My initial impressions after playing the final product is that of the 3 locomotion techniques, teleporting to normals felt the most intuitive and useful. Even though we designed the stages to encourage variation, most of them could easily be done by teleporting. This makes sense as teleportation is the most common locomotion technique, especially in games, and it seems that its utility extends to teleporting onto walls. The other techniques are fun, but may require a more specific use or environment to really shine. Snapping the player view sometimes left me confused as to where I ended up or where I was looking. We use different textures for different surfaces, but they're all very similar, and the environment is blocky, so it's easy to lose track of exactly where you are. A good solution for this is building non-symmetrical environments with noticeable landmarks and color coding. Slow falling and snapping seem to help with cybersickness, although this is purely anecdotal and I'm an experienced VR user, so we would need to run user tests on beginners and veterans to truly know whether these techniques helped. This project could be expanded by redesigning and adding stages for a more streamlined hand-holding experience. Like I said, most stages were easiest to complete by teleporting, so either by designing better stages or adding stage elements that restrict the effectiveness of teleporting, we could encourage players to use alternative techniques and help them learn how to use those techniques. We could also add the comfort techniques that were cut, as these have been researched and shown to help reduce cybersickness. Running user tests is a logical next step. This would help us discover if the locomotion techniques are intuitive and useful, if the experience is too disorienting or cybersickness inducing, and if other users discover the dominant utility of teleporting, or if they prefer other techniques. To make the platformer more of a puzzle game, we could add things like physics objects, doors, pressure plate circuits, moving platforms, etc., to make the game more complex and push the limits of the locomotion techniques.